Welcome back, everybody. Good morning. It's a great day for a great day. I'm Karen Brown. I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives here at the partnership. So for those of you who are returning for the second part of our series, welcome back. And if for those that it's the first time, we're happy to have you. So moving on, I just want to get us started and moving on to our next slide. As always, we'd like to thank our sponsors. Without them, our work isn't possible. But before I thank our sponsors, I am going to introduce our presenter today, the one and only Ekua Mends-Aidoo. If you have been here for our last session, you'll know the phenomenal work and the lessons that you're going to learn today. Our session today is microaggressions. All right, let's move on to our next slide. And now I will thank our sponsors. Our platinum sponsors today are Bank of America and M&T. Gold sponsors are Highmark of Western New York and Northwest. And then moving on to our silver sponsors, Five Star Bank, KeyBank, National Grid, and Yahoo. And our supporting sponsors are Evergreen and Bond, Chunk, and King. And again, thank you for all of our sponsors. Our next and final session will be our number 3 of our virtual learning series, December 1st. We will be talking about allyship with Dr. Latice Hairston. And so we invite you to join us for that session as well. Okay, moving on, I want to share with you some of our upcoming events. Our Young Professional Launch is at Seneca 1, 5:30 to 7:30, Wednesday, and I'm sorry, that's tomorrow. And our Wednesday, November 10th at Seneca 1 is the Buffalo Niagara Partnership Annual Report. So we hope to see all of you there as well. Okay, moving on to our next slide. Again, it gives me a great pleasure to present our presenter today, Ekua Mends-Aidoo. Good morning, Ekua.
Good morning, and welcome everyone. I just want to make sure, someone had mentioned that they could not hear. I just want to make sure that we're all set with audio. Are we all set?
I believe our audio should be good.
Okay,
I'm seeing people saying they can hear. Great.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, so we're going to jump right into the section. I am really excited to be here again for part 2 of the conversation in the D&I Learning Series with the partnership. I was already introduced, so I'm going to skip over that, but I am the principal consultant of Clementine Gold Group. So today we're going to talk about microaggressions, but we're going to get into the content by developing a shared language around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll introduce cultural humility and its benefits and differences from cultural competency, understand intent versus impact and the connection to microaggressions, and then lay the foundation for how we'll interrupt bias and create a culture of inclusion. And so, like always, I love to engage with folks. We're going to be using the chat function. We'll also use some poll options during the session today. And so we're going to start with an icebreaker. And what I want you to do, we're going to take about 15 seconds to think about this question, and then go ahead and put that in the chat when you're ready. What has shaped how you see the world from birth until now? And you can name 1 or 2 things in the chat, and then we'll read off some of those. So go ahead. Start putting those in the chat, and I'll start to read some of those off. So lived experiences, sports, education, socialization, social media, friends and family, parents, education, again, lived experiences, family, schools. Family is coming up multiple times here. Educational journey, the community that you live in. A lot of family, like I said, coming up, school experiences, how you were raised and socialized, the internet, living in a global village, family and upbringing, relationships, media, stories from families past, absolutely, experience and environment, and interactions that people have had with one another. Someone else said growing up in the military, religion, culture, faith, social groups, experiences at work, opportunities, children. So oftentimes people will talk about their family, their parents, how you were socialized. And so thank you for participating in that. We're going to move right along. Okay, so we're going to start by creating a shared language. Oftentimes, we'll have conversations with folks and think we're on the same page in terms of how we navigate conversations, only to find out later that there might be different representations and different understandings of what we're talking about. So in terms of developing a shared language, diversity, equity, and inclusion, this is the core foundation for what we're talking about today. When we talk about diversity, it's people and perspectives. And when you break down that diversity, there's an individual component of that looks like, your personality, the language that you speak, your learning styles and life experiences. But then there's also group dynamics to diversity as well. So group social differences, things like race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation, sexual identity, country of origin, your ability, status, political views, and so on and so forth. I also like to highlight the perspectives of people. We have different thoughts. We all come, like we said in the last slide, from different backgrounds, how we were socialized. And so there's a diversity in terms of the way that we think as well. Now, when we talk about inclusion, it's really how we're intentional in bringing people to the table. It's how we're actively engaging with people, bringing traditionally excluded groups to the table into the decision making. So that's giving people power, voice, organizational culture. It's how we set the table for how we interact with one another. And then lastly, equity. It's really resulting from policy, practice, and position. But one of the main things that I want you to think about is equity as removing the predictability of failure or success based on social factors. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So in talking about diversity, there's traits that are visible and invisible. And so things that are visible that you can usually see at an eye's glance, things like age, culture, gender, nationality, ethnicity, and race, mental or physical status. These are things that you might be able to see by looking at someone. Things that might be visible or invisible, things like veteran status. You wouldn't know that just by looking at someone. Religion, sexual orientation, language, and political views. And the things that you wouldn't know by looking at someone, working style preferences. This usually comes up often because there's this movement in terms of hybrid and people working remotely. You wouldn't know that by looking at someone. Diversity of thought, family status, values and belief, education, socioeconomic status, life experiences, and perspectives. Those are things that you wouldn't know. Now, in talking about equality versus equity, I like to give a definition of both of these because oftentimes we'll kind of get those confused and mixed up sometimes. So equality assumes that all circumstances and groups require the same resources. And what that does is it reinforces existing inequities. So you can tell by the picture, everyone's given the same size box, no matter how tall they are, and they still can't see over the fence. Whereas equity is really grounded in the strategy to address those inequities, and it reflects the optimal results for all circumstances and groups. And so on the picture, you can see that people are given the resources based on their needs and where they're coming from. And taking this a little bit further, there's a lot of conversations that you'll see moving beyond these pictures to talk about justice and what that looks like, because that's creating equitable outcomes for all and proactively removing barriers. So, in the picture for equity, you still see a fence in the sight of these folks. What justice does is it actually tears down that fence so that people have equal access and equal playing fields. And so, when we talk about racial equity, it really is allowing folks of all backgrounds, colors, creeds to thrive and be flourishing in the results that they might need as well. And I'm just going to highlight examining bias because we talked about it at the last session in full. But just to give you a reminder, when we talk about bias, the two that really come up to mind is implicit bias, which is also unconscious bias. And those are attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. And then explicit bias is when it's conscious. There's no room for question. This is when, we know that we're acknowledging stereotypes, attitudes, and beliefs. So next, I always like to start with this quote because, it really gives us a background for why we need to be centering diversity, equity, inclusion in everything that we do. And it's when people face barriers to achieving their full potential, the loss of talent, creativity, energy, and productivity is a burden for not only those that are disadvantaged, but for communities, businesses, and governments, and the economy as a whole. And this burden really is is seen everywhere, right? We all feel it. It's when people aren't reaching their full potential. And it's when people are stunting their growth in terms of what they can really produce in their lifetime. So one of the reasons why we focus in diversity, equity, and inclusion is we know that demographics are changing in America and honestly on a global scene as well. We know that by 2044, groups formerly seen as minorities will reach a majority status. We know that there's increased generational mixes and differences within the workplace. In 1950, population age 65 and older represented 8.1% of the total US population, and that percentage is expected to reach 20.2% by 2050. We also know that the millennial generation is the largest, most racially and ethnically diverse generation the US has ever known. We also know that more women are participating in the labor force. And by 2065, the US population won't have a single ethnic or racial majority. And so I'm going to pose this question to you all in the chat. Based on these demographics that you might have seen, what have your observations been in the workplace? And have you had to adjust how you do business? And so I'm going to give you about 15 seconds to respond, and I'll read some of those off, and then we'll move on. So how might you have had to change how you do business, and what have your observations been in the workplace, because of these changing demographics? And I'll just give you one example. In the healthcare field, we've really had to increase our bilingual folks that are greeting folks and that are interacting with patients, because we know that this shift is happening, especially in Buffalo. We're seeing new Americans come in and need translation services. That also translates into our marketing materials, because we want to make sure that folks can read and interact with us. So some folks saying more effort around diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Someone else mentioned the need for translating services as well. Let's see. Inclusive practices, culturally responsive services, absolutely. Learning the customs of different groups. There's a shift away from marginalizing folks, absolutely. Someone else said bilingual branches. I'm assuming that's banking. Increase cultural competency and making sure that we're understanding one another. Observe diversity higher up in the chain and more DEI initiatives being promoted. Looking for vendors that are diversified. So thinking about, your minority and women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, increasing that. Generations, more technology for faster services. Absolutely. I know in the healthcare field, we had to pivot on a dime because of the pandemic. Other folks are saying an attempt to be more inclusive, changing from a more hierarchical management structure to more collaborative one. And we'll talk a little bit more about organizational culture and what that looks like. Intergenerational differences and making sure that clients understand those interactions. Looking at marginalized customers as customers who bring value, absolutely. So really great feedback here. We're talking about different communication styles and methods to accommodate how millennials access news and information. Technology is really big in that way. Someone else mentioned they have to learn how to manage different groups that have different communication styles and avoid using too much jargon. And so talking about just the different ways that we have to show up because of these changing demographics. So thank you for participating in that and your feedback. So ultimately, we know that the world is changing, right? We know that the environment, we have to reshape the environment and influence how we do business, because the business is changing, just like some of you have mentioned. So like we said, changing demographics worldwide. In America, we're becoming a plurality nation because we don't have that single ethnic or racial majority. You're starting to see that shift happen in a lot of larger cities. There's increased generational mixes and differences. Ongoing war for top talent, for future top talent. A lot of folks are feeling this based on the pandemic. There's a lot of folks having conversations about the war on talent and making sure that you bring inclusive environments so that people feel more able to bring more of themselves to work. Clients and customer expectations. We also know that as generations shift, there's a real focus around how we do diversity, equity, inclusion, and people highlighting that in the work that they want to see the organizations that they go to bring forward. We also know that there's societal and cultural shifts, especially last year. There's been a lot of conversations around, how we're bringing this to work, growing multiracial and identity categories, and complex social issues as we move forward in this work. So what we're going to do is actually talk a little bit about culture to set the foundation of the conversation we're going to have around microaggressions. In terms of culture, we think about culture and subculture. You think about a lot of different things that come to mind. We know that culture is a common history and heritage. It's passed down from one generation to the next. Within cultures, we have common values, beliefs, customs, behaviors, traditions, institutions, art, folklore, and lifestyle. We talked a lot about this in the beginning, but similar relationship and socialization patterns. And that's, in the first session, we talked about how you see the world from birth until now. Socialization really sets the foundation for how we interact with one another. We also know that culture is a common language, shared geographic location of residence, and similar patterns of dress, and my favorite, diet, the different foods that come from different cultures. Now, when we talk about subculture, we know that it's a cultural group within a larger culture having beliefs or interests at variance with those of the majority larger culture. So I'm going to pose this question to the chat as well. In the United States, what are examples of subcultures? What do you see in terms of subcultures? I'll give you one of my favorite ones. I recently got a bike last year, and there's a biking culture that's really different from, driving culture. You see the world at a different level, right? In terms of how you, interact with things that are around you. And even in that biking culture, we've had conversations with groups that, do a lot of advocacy for transportation. And they talk about the differences even in that, the subculture of biking, fixies versus people who, might use some of the assisted biking, like the pedal bike, things like that. Someone else mentioned within the LGBTQ community, absolutely. Bill's Mafia, there's sports subculture, right? Bill's Mafia, Raider Nation, someone else said. CrossFit groups, there's a subculture in terms of the exercise that you like to do. The recovery community, substance users, single parent culture and two parent culture. The music scene, there's a lot of different subcultures within the music scene. Within faith and religion, there's subcultures that come from that as well. Skilled trades, vegans and vegetarians, there's a subculture amongst how we eat in terms of our diet. Music subculture, dog owners, animal owners, traveling culture, rural versus urban. Yogis, people who practice yoga, political and religious groups, social interests, new moms, veterans, and so on and so forth, right? Thank you for participating in that as well. So we know that subcultures really have a variance of the larger culture, and that's really what the difference is between those two. Now, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about dominant culture. In a society comprised of multiple cultures, and we're talking about the shift and change in demographics, dominant culture is a culture that exercises the most power and influence. This dominance is typically expressed as economic power, political power, and in socio-cultural norms, laws, institutions, values, and traditions of a society. And so we know that it can be achieved by a lot of different means, but economic power is one that often comes up. And you think about the different types of, dynamics that make up dominant culture. It's usually the people that influence the most in terms of shaping how our society is as well. So we're going to talk about values, and we'll talk about the dominant values within the United States. We know that values are ideas about what is good, right, wise, or beneficial. And the values of a culture identify its ideals and a general standard of what's good, bad, desirable, or undesirable. And so dominant values in the United States, things that we hear often, are things like achievement and success oriented. We really pride ourselves in achieving. Self-reliance, independence, autonomy, privacy, freedom, democracy, order, and security. US exceptionalism, which means, we're the best country there is on the globe. That's definitely a dominant value within the United States. How we approach our work, activity and work, morality, progress, material comfort. And so when you think about these things, and this is just a rhetorical question for you all to think about, if you identify with, say, two of these, how might that differ if someone else identifies with something else, right? How do we interact with people who vary from how we perceive the world? And we talked a lot about that in the first section around, bias and what that looks like, similar to me bias, affinity bias, and how we approach people that might be like us or different from us as well. And talking about norms, mores, and customs, we know that norms are specific governing behaviors, and they define what's required, acceptable, or prohibited in certain circumstances. We know that mores are social norms that provide the moral standards of a group or society that are strictly enforced. And customs are practices from the past, and those are also known as traditions. And so when you think about dominant customs within the United States, things like the Western calendar, we know that there's a lunar calendar, there's different traditions that people look at, religious traditions, secular traditions, sports and leisure. We talked about Bill's Mafia, talk about a subculture within the Buffalo community. And then other institutions, schools, churches, governments, family, and civic organizations. These are all dominant customs that shape how we interact with each other within the United States as well. Now, when we talk about culture, there's also organizational culture that comes along within the workplaces that we all are in. And so in talking about these different dimensions, I love this graphic because it really gives us an understanding of what subcultures might look like within our own working environments. And so there's visible things, right? And at the top of the iceberg, you see it's the way that we say we get things done. So this is what people see, they hear, they touch, taste, and smell. These are things that are explicitly learned, it's consciously learned, and easily changed. It's also objective knowledge. So when you think about the way that you describe your organization to folks, the vision, structure, strategy, shared values, policies, goals, procedures, this is the way that we say we get things done, right? This is outwardly looking. And when you look under the water and the iceberg, these are invisible things that we talk about in terms of dimensions of organizational culture. So invisible, what people believe, value, think, or feel. These are implicitly learned or unconsciously learned, and it's difficult to change and subjective to knowledge. So when you're thinking about feelings and traditions and stories, these are things that are passed down. When you come into a workplace, you might not have that first understanding of the organizational culture, but best believe other folks are going to tell you and give you history and give you stories from the past. These are shared assumptions, perceptions, values, norms, unwritten rules. I'd like to highlight that one because there's different cultures within workplaces and honestly, even in centers and departments. If you come to a meeting 5 minutes early, are you still late? That in some organizations that still might be the case. And so these are unwritten rules that you wouldn't know, just by being a part of the organization, but other folks might bring you into that dimension of organizational culture. And so in highlighting this iceberg, when you think about an organization like Uber is an organization that's really thought of, setting your own hours, the flexibility, the freedom. Outwardly, we think about Uber as giving, everyone a lot of access to transportation. And so underneath the iceberg, when you really looked at it, there were a lot of different harassment cases that were going on within the organization, so much so that leadership had to change. And there were a lot of conversations that happened, and that was under the water. Tesla was another organization that we know had to pay one of the highest discrimination cases more recently. And so these are subcultures and stories that are being told within. And those are the way that we really get things done versus outwardly what we project. So every organization has organizational culture, and we want you to be mindful of what that might look like and how you might shape that and change. Now, in terms of organizational cultures, we want to make sure that you think about some of the dominant norms that happen within organizations. And so we know that one of the things that we can do is adjust the cultural norms within organizations and adjust those standards. So when we talk about the norms, mores, customs, and values within organizations, things like perfectionism versus a culture of appreciation. Within organizations, you have this dominant culture of perfectionism where people, might be fearful of trying different things or trying new things because, it's not acceptable within organizations. Something like sense of urgency versus developing realistic work expectations. Those are things that are dominant cultures, this sense of urgency and really prioritizing quick or highly visible results that can exclude potential allies. We want to make sure that we're moving into developing realistic work expectations. Quantity versus quality. This is also a dominant norm within organizations. Quantity, production, and pushing things out versus quality, and really valuing organizational resources that slow things down and really make sure that we do things in a more standard way. Written communications versus other forms of communications, Written communication being the word in terms of how you move things forward versus coming to one another and having relationships and developing those over time. Another one is power hoarding versus inclusive leadership. Power hoarding is a dominant culture where, you know, someone might get into a position of authority and really doesn't allow other folks to be a part of that conversation and make sure that people are more included. Either or thinking versus acknowledging multiple views. And in the last session, we talked about this group think and how, you know, we push people to bring these different ideas, but then we want them to form and assimilate to the things that we've done in the past over time. Being polite versus addressing conflict directly. We know in different cultures, people have different norms in terms of how they interact with one another. So, you know, politeness versus addressing conflict directly is a cultural norm and standard that we might need to adjust within the organization as well. And individualism versus collectivism. And so making sure that we move from prioritizing individual needs to more collective needs within organizations. So we're going to actually move into the next section and talk about positionality and awareness. And we're going to do a couple of exercises within this as well. So when we're talking about positionality, right? In the beginning, I asked you to think about the ways that, you know, you see the world from birth until now. Everyone has a social location. And that's when we indicate groups that you belong to because of your place in history or society. All people have a social location, and that's defined by things like gender, race, social class, age, ability, sexual orientation, and geographic location. And each group membership confers a certain set of social rules, roles, power, privilege, or lack thereof. And so the quote on the left side says, knowledge is constructed by our interactions with the world around us. Who we are shapes what we know about the world, and our experiences shape the way that we think. And so, you know, in talking about socialization, we know that we see the world differently, right? Depending on what was taught and passed down. We know that those are reinforced through our institutions and cultural socialization, different messages that we hear, you know, church, schools, television, language, media. Growing up, we receive different messages about who might be valued, who might not be valued, who has power, who might not have power, who has the power to influence. And we also talk about those dominant norms in terms of who influences and how they influence. So in talking about privilege, power, and oppression, when I talk about privilege and I talk to different groups, I always ask people, you know, raise your hand if you feel like you have privilege, raise your hand if you don't. And so folks will raise their hand. And I said, for the folks that feel like they don't have privilege, why don't you feel that way? And then folks will say, you know, I've had to pull myself up by the bootstraps. You know, I've earned everything that I have. I wasn't born with a silver spoon. I really had to work hard and tough things out. And then I asked the question, how many of you remember back in grade school, remember those desks that you had to sit at where you had to raise the desk to sit down and put it back down? I said, how many people are left-handed? And so the lefties raised their hand. I said, what was your experience like, you know, sitting in those desks? And they said, oh, I hated it. I had to contort my whole body. I had to write on my lap. I would smudge my hand trying to write. It was difficult. And I said, okay, so we know that there's a such thing as right-handed privilege that comes along with you doing nothing to earn it, right? And so these are the things that we want to make sure that people understand. Privilege, by definition, it's unearned power giving certain groups different types of benefits, whether that be social, economic, political advantages, simply by virtue of belonging to those dominant groups in society. And it's often enjoyed unconsciously. Right-handed people, you know, can use scissors, can openers, things that are really difficult for lefties to use if you're not ordering something that's specialized. You know, within the office, is there a left-handed pair of scissors? Probably not, right? So now when we're talking about power, power is the ability to direct or influence the behavior of others. It can be political or social authority and control. And then lastly, when we talk about oppression, this is really through the systemic lens of oppression. It exists at the different levels of institutions, and they can be harmful policies and practices across structures within education, health, transportation, the economy, and they're interconnected and reinforced. And so in talking about, just kind of go back to power, we know that there's a variety of different ways that power can show up. There's positional power, power that comes from organizational authority or position. It's often overlooked by people with power and really forgotten by those without it. We know that there's a referred power, and that comes from connections to others. An example there is like staff members with formal positional power who might have known, the leadership for years, that this is a referred power. So I can refer to people that I know within that context. There's an expert power that comes from wisdom, knowledge and experience and skills, someone that might be widely respected because of your skills. There's ideological power that comes from an idea, vision, or analysis. And those, ideas really put individuals in the forefront. And there's different things like obstruction power, right? And that stems from the ability to coerce or block, whether implicit, threatened, or demonstrated. And those without other sources of power may depend on that as well, right? I need to just be an obstructionist because I don't have other means of power. And then there's personal power that I want to highlight as well. And that's a manifestation of an individual's energy, vision, and ability to communicate, and the capacity to influence. And so I want you to understand these concepts because we're actually going to move into the next section, and we're going to talk a little bit about the intersecting axis of privilege, domination, and oppression. So we're going to actually do an exercise here. And what I want you to do, I'm going to blow this up on the screen in the next slide, but I want you to count the amount of norms, societal norms that you have on the top versus the ones that you have on the bottom. And then what you can do is write that as a fraction in the chat if you are comfortable doing that. And so count the amount that you have on the top versus the amount that you have on the bottom. And I'm going to give you a little bit of time to do that. Just to let you know, Anglophone means English is your first language. And I always give everyone a freebie. You all are beautiful people, so make sure that you mark yourself as attractive because you're all beautiful people. And so I'm going to give you just about 2 minutes to do this. Count the amount that you have in the top versus the amount that you have in the bottom. And then when you're done, go ahead and put that in the chat group as a fraction, the amount that you have on the top versus the bottom. I wish I had some music to play just to give you a few moments. And so you're counting the amount on the top versus the bottom. Okay, so some of them are starting to come in. And while they're coming in, I'm just going to read a few different things. So we recognize privilege often as it relates to race. We often talk about, white privilege from that lens of privilege. But this example and this exercise is really to show you how, we're all a part of in-groups or out-groups, depending on what we're talking about and depending on that focus. And so if you've never had to worry about being physically harmed because of your sexual orientation or gender identity, you have unearned privilege. If you always knew you'd be able to go to college if you wanted to, you have unearned privilege. If you're right-handed, we talked about that as well, right? Right-handed people having access to scissors, righties, if you want to take a chance at using your left hand to cut things, you'll see how difficult that might be. But you also have unearned privilege as right-handed folks. If you can easily find symbols that represent your religious beliefs and holidays, things like decorations, greeting cards, food that you might eat within your culture, you also have unearned privilege as well. If you can find a place to worship, easily finding a place to worship, you also have unearned privilege. If you've never had to been asked, where are you really from, maybe because of your accent or appearance, you also have unearned privilege as well. And so I know folks are continuing to put those in the chat group. You can continue to do that. But what I want you to think about, and this is just a rhetorical question for you to think about, which of your identities might be considered privilege? What types of identities that we just talked about might be considered privilege? And then how is that wheel and that positionality the same or different than those that you serve in the work that you do? And so we want you to just become more aware and cognizant of those differences in terms of how you interact with folks, and think about that a little bit in terms of, what you might do to create more inclusive environments for those that might be different than you. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about intent versus impact. And, when I've done this in the past, I usually ask people, raise your hand if you've ever stepped on someone else's foot. And I said, raise your hand if you've ever had your foot stepped on. For the people that raise their hand that stepped on someone else's foot, what generally happens next? And people say, oh, I apologize. I say, hey, I'm going to watch where I'm going next time. Some people have said, if I made a smudge on their shoe, I'll make sure to clean it off. I'll tell them I'm watching where I'm going next time. I'm so sorry. I'll not make that mistake again, even though, you might do that. And some people, jokingly say, hey, it depends on the type of shoe that they're wearing. I might clean it off if it's a nice shoe. But ultimately, you apologize, you accept full responsibility. And then I also ask, okay, what else? What else might you do when you step on someone else's foot? I ask, do you keep your foot on that person's foot and keep crunching on their toes, or do you lift it off? And they say, oh, absolutely. I take it off. I'll watch where I'm going next time. So understanding, this notion of stepping on someone else's foot, you understand intent versus impact. Intent is you didn't intend to hurt someone, but the impact might have been hurtful. And so in this dynamic and stepping on someone else's foot, we never blame them and say, hey, stop being a baby, get over it. It doesn't hurt that bad. No, you accept full responsibility in that interaction. I apologize, I accept ownership, and I move forward in terms of that interaction. And so one of the things that I talk about in terms of intent versus impact is actually a story of a situation that happened to me in a working environment. And I had a colleague who had his wife was actually his wife's sister had two kids who were biracial, and they were mixed children. And he would come to me and ask me different things, him being a white male, asking me, hey, how might I do my daughter's hair, or, give different examples of that. And we used to talk all the time. Until one day he actually came to me and said, hey, Ekua, guess what? I'm going to get the Best Black Father of the Year award, and laughed. And of course, my face, I questioned that. What do you mean? What are you saying? Like, what do you mean by that? I had a colleague that was around and also found that offensive. To make matters worse, another colleague repeated the same thing. Haha, did you hear what he said? He's going to get the Best Black Father of the Year award. And so in this is intent versus impact. He crunched on my toes in that moment. I was really, taken aback by what he said. But instead of accepting full responsibility for what he said, oh, Ekua, get over, I'm just joking. It's just a joke. Get over it. Stop being so sensitive in that moment. And so intent versus impact give us the real foundation to understand what microaggressions look like. And this is the crux of the conversation that we'll have today. And we're actually going to watch a quick video to give you an example of what this might look like and how it relates to the work that we do. But in terms of this video and watching this video, there is a little bit of vulgarity in terms of some of the explanations. So just a warning there. I'm going to play this and then we'll come right back and talk about some of the definitions.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem.
Oh, you're so well spoken.
Oh, just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while...
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
Sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date...
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
Going grocery shopping.
Everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
Commuting to work.
So when are you gonna have a baby?
Watching TV.
We have to keep the Redskins' name. It's part of our culture and history.
Or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John?
Give me shopping advice.
So bad. I love Cher too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day.
Can I touch your hair?
Multiple times a day.
So pretty.
Can I touch it,
hair?
please? Can I please?
Is fucking annoying. And makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes. Which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares?
Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try less challenging, Major.
Ow! My dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
He looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
Okay, so I like that video because we all know what it feels like to get bit by mosquitoes, right? And that's where the term, you can really understand where microaggressions come from. And so in talking about microaggressions, Dr. Harrison, Letice Harrison, who you'll hear from in the next presentation, she talks about how microaggressions really, the word micro minimizes these interactions with folks. And there's a French author who talks about microaggressions in relation to symbolic violence. And that's something that I mentioned in the first session. Symbolic violence. This is the violence that we have in terms of the interactions with people, because oftentimes, comments are coming from someone within a dominant group, right? Dominant group making a comment about someone else. And so I just want you to keep that in mind. Although we're talking about them as microaggressions, these really over time, like you saw in the video, create these different violent interactions with folks. So in terms of the definition of microaggressions, it's a subtle behavior, verbal or nonverbal, conscious or unconscious, directed at a marginalized group member that has a derogatory and harmful effect. And this term has been around since the 1970s. The term symbolic violence has been around, as it relates to microaggressions since like the 1990s. In terms of the categories of microaggressions, there's 3 different ones that I want you to think about. Micro assaults, those are the most overt microaggressions. The person committing that act was intentional and knew that their behavior might be hurtful. And the example there is using a derogatory term against a person of color. Micro insults are more subtle than micro assaults, but nevertheless still have harmful effects on marginalized group members. And the example there is implying a woman or person of color received their job due to something like affirmative action. And then micro invalidations, comments and behaviors that deny the experiences of those group members. An example there is insisting that prejudice is no longer a problem in society, or telling a group member they're being oversensitive to a racist or sexist comment. In the example that I gave you, it was definitely an invalidating moment where he said, "Oh, just get over it. I didn't mean that. It was just a joke." So in terms of how we interact when we see these types of things that happen in front of us, it goes back to the organizational culture. What type of organization are you trying to create in terms of how we interact with one another and how we feel like we belong within organizations? And so I want to give you 2 different tools to think about: calling out versus calling in. And I'll give you reasons for why you might call out and why you might call in. And then we're going to go through a couple case studies where I give you examples and launch some polls and ask what you would do in that situation. So in terms of calling out, we call out when we need to let someone know that their words or actions are unacceptable and they will not be tolerated. It's when we need to interrupt in order to prevent further harm. It'll likely be hard and difficult. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. And it allows us to hit the pause button and break up the momentum for what's happening in front of us. And then in terms of calling in, it's when there's an opportunity to explore deeper and make more meaning together, find a mutual sense of understanding across differences. It's when we're seeking to understand or learn more from one another. And it allows us to have this paradigm shift around what we might be talking about. It's when we want to help imagine different perspectives, possibilities, or outcomes. And it provides for multiple perspectives. So it's when we can think about things in a variety of different ways. It's focused on reflection and not a reaction. And it's not just a suggestion with an uptick in terms of how you speak. Like, don't you think you might want to, stop doing that? It's no, let's have a conversation about this and really understand one another to make sure that we're on the same page moving forward. And so you can use these tools to call in or call out depending on the situation. And so we're actually going to do a couple case studies, and usually we'll have conversations within groups. But what I want you to do, I'm going to launch the poll after I read these questions, and then I want you to give examples for why you might call someone out. So think about that now. So you might put that in the chat group so I can read some of those off. The first example is a participant in a mixed group makes a derogatory comment about another participant's speech disability. Sensing a negative response from the rest of the group, they excuse the comment, saying that the other participant is an old friend and they joke around like this all the time. The person with a disability that's referred to sits there quietly. They don't say anything. What would you do now in that situation? Would you call out or would you call in? I'm going to launch that poll and give you the opportunity to respond, call in or call out. And then while you're doing that, go ahead in the chat group and put why you might call in or call out in that situation. All right, so the responses are starting to come in. Okay, so they're saying call out because the behavior needs to be stopped quickly. Someone else said call out as well. It's not funny and it's not okay, so that's why you might call out. Call out to make sure that others don't think that this is acceptable behavior, absolutely. Need to confront the assumption. The victim needs to know that others know the behavior is not acceptable, it's not okay. Call out and use as a teaching moment. Call out is very public and you don't co-sign that. And this is some of the feedback that we get from folks, right? When it's a public situation like this, ensuring that the environment is one that is inclusive, you know, kind of making sure in a public way that might be the case as well, right? Okay, so a lot of folks saying call out because their comment was offensive and needs to be corrected. Everyone needs to be made aware that this comment was not okay. So thank you for participating in that question. And we're actually going to move to the next question. Okay. And the next case study, a colleague at work who identifies as transgender is misgendered by a newer employee. How would you approach the newer employee? Would you call out or would you call in? And go ahead and start voting on that one. And then start to put those reasons for why you might call in or call out in this situation. An honest mistake. So that's why someone would call in. Seeking more understanding. Newer employee may not be aware of the person's gender identity yet. Call in and help them learn. This is a learning opportunity. Education, a lot of folks saying education, an opportunity for learning and giving people a chance to learn. So you're going to call in that situation. Thank you for participating in that one. And then the last one we're going to look over is Sam, a young staff person born in Ecuador who has lived in the States for 15 years, recently starts at your company. At his first staff meeting, he's asked to introduce himself and he mentions that he's from Ecuador. One of the colleagues responds, "Wow, but your English is so good." What would you do in this situation? Would you call in or would you call out? And then go ahead and start to put that why, you know, in the chat box, why you might call in or call out. Okay, educate with empathy on both sides. Some folks are saying call out because it's offensive and has to stop quickly. Someone else said that this is a similar experience that has happened to them. It's an ingrained belief and not an honest mistake, so that's why they would call out. Someone else said the person might not know that it's offensive. And, you know, I've heard this in the sessions that I've done in the past where people have said it might be a compliment, right? People might think that it's a compliment. I think, you know, in this situation, that's why some folks have said that they would call in just to make sure that they understood that it wasn't something that was meant to be offensive. And then someone else said the intent might be good, but the impact is not, right? And I want you to think about that through that lens. Thank you for putting that in there. Oftentimes, you know, we give these examples and I only give you the option to call in or call out. The reality is some of these might be blended opportunities to call in and call out, right? To make sure that the environment of your organization, it's known that this isn't tolerated or acceptable, but then also giving people the opportunity to be educated and give them resources to allow them to learn more. So in these different circumstances, there's not necessarily a straight answer in terms of call in or call out, but I want you to start to get these understandings of the tools that you can use to make sure that your environments are a little bit more inclusive. Now, in terms of next steps, the reason why we want to make sure that you're aware of these and give you some tools and resources to confront them is because we know that there's benefits to having organizational inclusive culture. When your organization is more inclusive, you're 2 times more likely to exceed or meet financial targets, 3 times as likely to be high performing, 6 times more likely to be innovative and agile, and 8 times more likely to build better business outcomes. Ultimately, we know without inclusion, it's difficult to maintain the diversity within your organizations. Without giving people the tools to really interject and interrupt bias, it allows for organizations to have a culture that is not welcoming to all folks. And so lastly, I want to just give you, a concept about cultural humility, because this is what we want to ground the work that we do around microaggressions and the symbolic violence. Just to give you the definition of cultural humility, it's the ability to maintain an interpersonal stance that is other-oriented or open to others in relations to aspects of culture that are cultural identity that are most important to that person. And so 3 things that I want you to remember. Features of cultural humility, it's a lifelong commitment. You're never going to be done learning about other people's culture. It helps to fix those power dynamics that we talked about in terms of that cultural dominance within organizations. And it also allows us to develop partnerships with people and groups who advocate for one another. So, with your client and customer base, you want to make sure that you're approaching folks in a cultural humility way, culturally humble way. When you think about the word humble, you think about removing ego, allowing to yield for other opportunities and other identities. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between cultural competence and cultural humility, and then give you some examples of next steps that you can do and then open up for Q&A. So in terms of cultural competency, a lot of you have taken these courses, different cultural competency courses over time. I'm going to just talk about the differences between cultural competency and cultural humility. So cultural competency is really when we're building an understanding of minority cultures to better and more appropriately provide service, whereas cultural humility encourages personal reflection and growth around culture in order to increase awareness. And that's usually your own awareness to see how you show up in the world. We did that exercise of social location and positionality. Cultural competency is based in knowledge and training, whereas cultural humility is based in awareness and co-learning. We're learning with one another. Cultural competency is a competence in a culture other than one's own, whereas cultural humility says, there's no possibility to be competent in someone else's culture. It's ongoing knowledge about other cultures over time. Cultural competency is based in academia. You can get certified. You pat yourself in the back because you took a course on the LGBTQ community. Now you know everything there is to know about the community, which we know that's not possible. So cultural humility is based on experience with no end result, right? We're always going to be learning about one another. And then lastly, cultural competency promotes skill building and obtaining goals, whereas cultural humility places all parties in a mutually beneficial relationship, and it lessens those power dynamics in terms of that cultural dominance that we talked about a little bit earlier. So I want you to kind of soak in, this concept of cultural humility and shift your thinking towards this awareness about yourself and how you interact with others. And so lastly, we're gonna just watch this video, and I really love this video. It's called Inclusion Starts with I. We know that everyone comes into the workplace with different identities, and we're gonna just watch this and talk about how we can really build inclusive cultures with understanding. All right. And like I said, I love that video because it really shows you that we all come to the workplace with a variety of differences. But ultimately, we all have the ability and the authority to create more inclusive environments because it starts really with us. And so lastly, I want to just talk a little bit about an action plan, things that you can do within your organization to further this conversation. And the question that I pose to you all is, what can you do, on an individual level and within your organization to make sure that you're fostering a more inclusive environment for all? And so I want you to think about things you can start doing, stop doing, continue doing, or do differently, and identify opportunities within your organizations to interrupt bias, suggest actions. What actions can you take in the long term and the short term? And then how will you measure success? What metrics will you use to determine success as well? And just to leave you with a few different resources, we talked a lot about bias in the last session, but the Harvard Implicit Association test. There's this toolkit around how you interrupt bias, and there's also a diversity toolkit. If you Google this, it's a guide to discussing identity, power, and privilege, and it's a free guide online. And I believe that's the Masters of Social Work program at USC, if you see that. And then there's some articles that you can also look at, the cultural humility, to understand that concept a little further. So now I want to open it up for questions. Thank you all for participating. It was really great conversation in the chat. We also have the Q&A function. So if you want to ask a question there, I know Karen's going to come back on, and then we'll end there.
I am coming back on. Ekua, first of all, I don't know where the time went. All right. When you were getting to the end, I was like, wait a minute, that was like the fastest time and so informative. So thank you from the partnership. Just thank you for partnering with us and bringing your wisdom and your knowledge and sharing it with everybody. So thank you so much. We are going to open it up to questions. I'll be monitoring the chat. But I just want to tell you some of my takeaways. I always have to bring myself into the conversation because I'm excited to continue to learn. The cultural humility and the cultural competence was absolutely brilliant. I'm already planning a session in my head on that one. So that was fantastic. And thank you so much for bringing those terms to the forefront. So I'm going to start to monitor the chat.
Okay.
And let's see what we have there. Well, we're seeing a lot of thank you so much. Love every day. It's about the big and small. Let me get over to the Q&As. Would you please send out the link to the webinar? Yes, we will send out the link to the webinar for everyone. And so some of the questions that we have here is, how do you assure call out does not become a type of microaggression at the offender?
At the offender?
Yes.
Yeah, so, in terms of calling out, and the reason why I gave you those examples of call out is because in that moment, right, the offender, whether they know it or not, are producing harm to someone else. And so we need to stop that in that moment. It's like, you're about to see a train crash, right? And before it fully crashes, you need to stop that in the moment. And so although it might be difficult to do so, the offense that person might be causing is going to be very harmful. And so in that moment, I think you can, ensure that someone knows that it's not okay. But then also, that's why we say the call out, you can also call right back in and let people know, what you were saying was harmful. I had to stop that in the moment. But here's some reasons why, right? This is the reason why I had to do that. And this is giving you some examples of that. So it might seem harsh, but we see the harm that it's causing. And so we have to step up and do that. So ultimately, I think there's an ability to call in and call out. But sometimes it'll be difficult. And sometimes, we'll have to have those follow-up conversations afterwards.
And great. Another question that we have, do you think microaggressions occur more online than they do in person?
It's interesting. I think, the culture of being online, people kind of seem a little bit removed, right? And so the relationship might not be there where people care how they might offend someone. So you see that happen online a lot. It's a reason why one of my really good friends, Kendra Brim, and I, we do a podcast called the Black Gems Dive In podcast. And we talk a lot about not reading comments online, right? And really not getting into it because some folks really don't care. I do think a lot of those things happen online because there's that removing from the relationship. And so it's something that, I definitely keep in mind and see often. So absolutely.
Yes. And another great question, how do you deal with a slur that many people don't even know is a slur, and you are a part of the group that is slurred, but present as white?
Interesting.
Yes.
That's a very interesting question. I think in these situations, the education piece is going to be really important in terms of how we educate people, because oftentimes in that cultural humility example, we talk about the open and awareness of others and cultural identity that are important to that other person. We have to ensure that we don't always put the focus on the person who might be getting that slur to do the education. And that's why we want to educate other folks on how to call in and call out, to give other people the resources to do that. Because ownership shouldn't just be felt on the people that are getting that violence, the symbolic violence action occurred against them. So I'll always go back to education and getting people the education, but also doing it in a way where people can receive that information, right? When you have those developed relationships, it allows for folks to have a little bit more of onus in terms of that conversation. So I would go back to education in that case.
And that's interesting because it kind of ties to the next question. And it says the responsibility to speak up and defend and educate people seem to lie in the hands of the people receiving it. And they said, I am exhausted. What advice do you have for me?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I always tell people, take care of yourself, right? This work is not easy work. It's uncomfortable. And that's why we try to get people the language and ability to have conversations and educate people around this, because it is exhausting, right? It can be exhausting, but being uncomfortable with or being comfortable with the uncomfortable is what we're trying to do to create more of that balance around everyone. And so I always say, take care of yourself, right? Like, you don't need to take that ownership every single time, that something like that happens, but also relying on allies to step in and step out. I know the next session with Dr. Letice Harrison is around allyship, and I'm sure she'll give different tools for how you create those relationships with folks to, sharing that ownership of the conversation.
Yeah, and this is interesting. I attended a seminar yesterday, and I don't know if anybody's familiar with Minda Harts. And if you're not, Google her and get some of her books. And what she talked about was interesting to me. She's like, we always are talking about uncomfortable conversations, and she said we need to have uncomfortable listening. Be uncomfortable in your, and I was like, oh, I'm going to steal that. And in fact, I sent her a message. So she's got some great books out, but I think in that microaggression, you have to be uncomfortable when you're listening. If someone, provides you with that information, hey, this offended me and this is why. So not to go into that defensiveness, but really just sit there in the listening and sit in the information that they're sharing you. Yeah, so I thought that was really great. So Google her, Mindaharts. She's amazing. She's got a lot of good books out. Another question, Ekua, we have is claiming colorblindness considered a microaggression?
It is, absolutely it is. And there's, Karen, I'll send you this tool because it actually has some different examples of microaggressions so that people might even become more aware of what is considered one. Color blindness is definitely a microaggression because what it does is it diminishes and dismisses someone's identity and their cultural identity. So in that moment, oh, I don't see color, usually that comes when someone is committing some type of microaggression or offense. And so by saying you don't see color and dismissing it, it really dismisses that person and different pieces and parts of that person. So absolutely it is. And it's on that sheet that I'll send as a resource afterwards.
All right, fantastic. And if we got some great questions coming in. Awesome. It says, thank you for another informative training. Context for my question. I'm a blue-eyed white woman with long blonde hair and conventionally attractive. I work at a not-for-profit serving immigrants. Due to my appearance, I absolutely benefit from the perception bias and halo effect, specifically in interactions with our clients. My question is, how do I navigate this responsibly?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, thank you for that question. I think one of the biggest things that we can do, and I'll go to allyship again, is using your privilege to benefit others, right? If you know, especially if you're aware of that specific privilege, how can you use that to benefit others? And how can you use that privilege to make sure that other people are feeling more included and given opportunities? So I think opening the door for people who might historically be excluded is a way that you can totally use that privilege for good. And I think that's a really great question because it's grounded in what can I do with what I have, right? Sharing with those that might not be as privileged as you. So awareness is really huge. I think you can continue in that awareness and that journey in terms of your social location and how you might be able to then extend that to other people who don't benefit in the same way.
Yeah, and also doing it bravely. And I'll give you an example, and this has happened to me. I was in a meeting, only person of color, not here, not at the organization I work in now, I want to be clear. And someone had said something, which was a microaggression. I can't even remember specifically what it was. But after the meeting, someone came up to me and said, "Oh, wow, Karen, I can't believe, Joe said that to you. And I really support you." And I was like, "Well, why didn't you support me in the meeting?" Not the after effect, because I can't be, or we can't be the only ones that are speaking up. Our allies really need to stand up in that moment and help support that and help create an environment where we can all be safe and express ourselves. So I just thought I'd add that, but I want to get to more questions because, I'll get distracted easily. How can you call someone out when their actions are validated because of a shared point of privilege?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
That's a good one.
It's a good one because I think, I've had the situation and this dynamic. Honestly, I gave you the example because at that time, someone in leadership repeated exactly what someone else said to me in that moment. In that moment, though, I had a colleague of mine who was a white woman who actually was really upset about what was said and went to leadership and made that known as well as an ally in that moment for me. The reality is the culture still was what it was, right? And it proved to be difficult. But in those type of situations, education doesn't always work because this is just the cultural norm. And I think that's why, I made a focus on without inclusion, it's difficult to maintain diversity because people will leave those type of situations over time. And so addressing it, confronting it, bringing awareness and education is one way to do that. But ultimately over time, if people are not receptive to that, then it might lead to, retention issues within organizations. And so that's why we highlight this work. So as much as possible, bringing things to light, bringing awareness to it, working within HR departments as well, right? Going to HR and making it known to those folks so that they can intervene where necessary as well. Bringing outside resources sometimes is helpful. Different consultants that can come in. One of the things that I like to do is this cultural audit where we just survey and audit what's happening within organizations and give that feedback to leadership with suggestions and things that might need to change over time. So those are things that you can do within organizations to create this baseline of information, a foundation of information, and then as much as possible educate, but ultimately, like I said before, first and foremost, personal safety and psychological safety is important. So you have to protect yourself over time.
Yep. I love the idea of the cultural audit. I think because oftentimes, and we found that even in our survey, the higher you go up in the chain of command, I'll call it, your vision or your view of what's going on in the organization from an inclusion standpoint, changes. And I love that culture audit and making sure you're getting all the associates, especially the people that are experiencing, the microaggressions and the unconscious bias. I mean, that's a good litmus test onto, are we really making an impact? Because if you think, oh, we've hired so many people of color, look at our numbers, we're so inclusive, but you talk to the individuals that are experiencing the microaggressions, how's it going? You ask them, how's it going? And they're like, well, not much has changed for me.
Right.
So you really have to get all of those opinions and really do the cultural audit starting all the way up, So I love that idea of the cultural audit as well. And we have more questions.
I'll just say in that example of the cultural audit too, you do want to make sure, to your point, Karen, you're getting a variety of different voices, at the table. So whether that be leadership, whether that be frontline staff, and people who interact with the clients that you serve, you want to get the clients and stakeholders' perceptions as well, to make sure that you can create that environment. So it's something that you do, and I always tell people you can't, unknow what you know now, right? So in getting that information, putting it out there, there's an accountability now to move forward and make some changes as needed.
Yes, definitely. We've got some good questions. There's one that's going to be really good. Well, they're all really good, but I got one I can't wait to hear how you answer it. But the next one we have is, we often view microaggressions from the lens of unconscious bias and see them as opportunity to educate and inform the offender. However, Dr. Ibram Kendi, one of my favorites, talks about microaggression as being acts of racism, plain and simple, which in a lot of cases they are. How do we tell the difference and handle appropriately, call out, call in, zero tolerance, etc.?
Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you for that question. A very great question. And that's why I explained, we talk about microaggressions and the concept of micro in itself diminishes and dismisses sometimes the act that is occurring. So that's why we talk about this symbolic violence, because it is. And when I talked a little bit about oppression earlier, oppression in terms of systems is shown as the isms, right? So sexism, genderism, racism, homophobic different interactions with folks. And so the reality is, a lot of these interactions are based in those isms and oppression. And so to that person's point, a lot of organizations in terms of best practices are doing things like putting policies in place that specifically, explicitly call that out. Zero tolerance behavior, when these interactions happen, bringing people directly in for education through the lens of your human resources systems. And so just making sure that there's an opportunity to bring that awareness to people directly, confront it directly, but then also know that it is based in some of those isms, right? And so understanding that concept of oppression and systemic, how that shows in systems is something that we need to make sure that we're putting to the forefront, but also creating an environment which people know that people have their back, right? At the end of the day, if something like this occurs, there's a direct consequence and ability to kind of connect on that specific issue, for sure.
And thank you for that question. And thank you for reading Dr. Kendi. He's amazing. Another great question. As a parent of mixed children, you would be amazed at how many times I'm asked, may I touch their hair? No, I wouldn't be amazed.
Yeah.
But what is the best response? And I have an answer to that, but we'll go away from what I'd say and turn it back up to Ekua to give you. Ekua is going to give us a little bit more better educated answer.
I don't know if my answer is going to be more educated in that sense, but I think I've had these conversations with folks in the past around, what the cause might be to people, because they're seeing something that might be different to them. But the reality is, personal space is still people's personal space, and you have to respect those boundaries before you just, go in and touch someone. So, the uneducated, I think, response that I've seen in the past, just to, put some humor to it, I guess, is when that happens to someone, people automatically, the person that might be getting their head touches that person's head to show you, hey, this is an awkward interaction. But I think the educated response in that is to call in, right? In that certain dynamic, right? Especially if this is somebody that you know. If it's someone that you don't know, that's a completely different conversation because of that personal safety and boundary. And so calling out and also putting a barrier and boundary up to, that's your child. I wouldn't imagine, that being a great interaction. But I think the call in, especially if it's someone that you know, is to say, hey, how would you feel if someone just came up to you and touched you without your permission, right? And making sure that you basically is holding up the mirror and showing people that that's not an acceptable interaction. So I think that's an educated, semi-educated response.
Yes.
I'm interested in hearing what your response would be.
Well, people that know me outside of this, they know what my answer to that is. It's not ready for prime time. Let's say that my answer to that question is. And what's so funny is I was telling my husband about how many times people have wanted to touch my hair. And he's like, I'm just baffled by that. But it happens. It's such a common microaggression. And I think the worst part about it, for the person to ask the question, at least people asked, may I touch your hair? That has happened to me and multiple people that I know. People don't even ask. They just come up to you and touch your hair. And so it's interesting. I was at some store the other day and my hair was actually natural. And let me tell you, it is a mess when it is. And someone came up to me and said, oh, I love your hair. It's so fuzzy. I mean, it's so fuzzy looking, a total stranger. So I was kind of like, okay, I'm not sure how we got there, but I just was like, I said, thank you. And I'm not sure that was appropriate. So anyway, I think we're wrapping up. I'm trying to watch our time. We have a few more minutes. And so we have a little bit more time for a few more questions. If anybody has any questions, or anything else, Ekua, you want to add? I know we've talked about, all of your sources or any other advice you want to give us about microaggressions or unconscious bias altogether?
I was going to say, I saw someone in the chat group ask, are there other examples of privilege that weren't on the earlier exercise? For example, having a stable home life could be a privilege. And so there's another wheel, a wheel of privilege and power that shows the different dynamics about, the center, things that are closer to the center being more dominant. And so in that, cisgender, right? Being someone who's a cisgendered man, being a citizen. We didn't talk a lot about that in terms of, especially with the new immigrants and Americans, new Americans that are coming into our city. Education, post-secondary, having the opportunity to have more education, heterosexual, neurotypical, and this is one that we don't often talk about in terms of ability and status, right? Some neurodivergence or significant neurodivergence that moves kind of closer to the exterior of that wheel. Another one that we don't often talk about is size privilege, right? Being slimmer as a privilege within the way that we interact with others, and then larger body sizes being on the skirts of that, right? On the outskirts of that as well. So I think those are a couple of different ones that we didn't bring up that I wanted to mention as well.
And if you could talk a little bit, Ekua, about environmental microaggressions. That's something that I've started reading a little bit more about. If you can talk about those.
Yeah, it's interesting because another thing that we do in terms of my consulting firm is an environmental inclusive assessment. So coming into like a climate inclusive assessment, coming into an organization and surveying what you might see, right? What pictures are on the wall? Who do they represent? What music might be playing in the lobby? Is it one that's more inclusive? If it's one that's not. And I've worked with a client who talks about how, in their waiting rooms, it was only a certain type of music. And so people coming in complaining about the music. I think we just talked about size, right? What type of chairs do you have in your waiting rooms? In the healthcare industry, we purposely get, chairs that will fit all different types of body sizes because, people not feeling as included if they can't fit in a seat. And so those are examples of ways that you might survey the environments that we work in. Another one, in bathrooms, sometimes people will have different products for folks to use, you know, is that inclusive, right? Hair care products that might only fit a certain person's hair or exclude other people. So really making sure that you're surveying and seeing at the ground level, are there ways that people, when they first experience, you know, our organization or our cultural environment, is it one that's inclusive as well? So those are things that you might want to think about as you do this work.
Yeah, fantastic. We have a comment that I'm going to share. It says, if you see or hear immigrant communities you work with idolizing your domestically conventional beauty, maybe sharing with them the beauty and strength you see in them, using your privilege to open up space in conventional beauty. So
Yeah.
that's a great comment. Thank you for sharing that.
It is a great comment. And I think those are the opportunities to highlight, you know, especially the artwork that you're using, you know, just another way to highlight, I think, those types of differences that we see amongst people. So being cognizant of that, being aware of it, and highlighting that to move forward and make sure that people feel more included.
And you know what, these conversations that we're having and all the topics that you're bringing up is just setting us up beautifully for our next session of you know, our next session of allyship, and how all of these things, you'll see how we strategically put these topics together and how they do come together and land in allyship and really creating in that inclusive environment. Just a couple things. I see Sarah dropped our survey into the chat. So please take our survey. I just want to remind people, this is how we build programs for you. And this is how we support everybody in our educational and our learning and growing process together. We respond to what our members and our community want. So please take a few minutes to take our survey. Sarah's dropped it in there. I do believe we'll also email it out. So you'll have an opportunity, but the quickest way to do it is just click that link right now and give us some data and some information. I'm going to close my chat up. And I think we have a couple more slides. Everyone's saying thank you. No, I want to thank everyone really for being here and continuing to grow. It is a journey. We say it all the time. It is a journey, this process of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And thank you, everyone. The session was amazing, of course. Look who our facilitator was. So, and hold on to your hats. Our next one's coming up. It's going to be just as fantastic. And again, as always, I want to thank our sponsors, our platinum sponsors, Bank of America, M&T Bank, our gold sponsors. My screen's being blocked from all of the wonderful accolades that we're getting. So thank you, everyone. Our gold sponsors are Highmark, Western New York, and Northwest. Moving on to our next ones. Oh my gosh, my chat's going, it's popping up on my screen. I love that. I love seeing that. Our silver sponsors, Five Star Bank, Key Bank, National Grid, Yahoo. Supporting sponsors is Evergreen Health. And then also Bond, Shunick, and King are our supporting sponsors. And all of you, thank you for continuing the partnership with the partnership. No pun on those words. Ekua, I cannot thank you enough for partnering with us and sharing your knowledge and your expertise. And everyone will see you for our final session. May we continue to grow and learn together. And as we all know, I'd be remiss if I didn't say go Bills. So thank you, everyone, for your time. We are ending right on time, and thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, go Bills. Remember to visit our website for more events and resources. See you soon, everyone.